Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey, Herman and Corn. So just when you thought I couldn't possibly get any cooler, I'm now walking around the apartment wearing my Bluetooth headset with Ezra looking at me like, what is this? What is this guy even doing? And the reason I'm doing that is because I was trying to record this prompt next to him and the little man was squawking. Obviously, he feels very passionate about NTP time servers. I mean, that again just furthers my belief that Ezra is the coming generation of tech, the incoming wave of tech talent in Israel. So we have to nurture this little man very carefully. So Herman and Corn, my lame jokes aside, I do want to ask you today about a topic that popped up for me yesterday. So as you know, Hannah and I are really up the walls at the moment with getting ready for our latest apartment move, which neither of us really feel like doing. But we have to, our lease is expiring and the whole, fiasco we had here. So we were in Tel Aviv yesterday for a meeting, and I said that as an act of self-kindness, I'm going to stop by and try to find a LCD wall clock. So you guys know that I'm a big fan of computer ergonomics, or that I draw a lot of my cues and inspiration from control centers, which is why when people come into my office, they sometimes ask if I'm plotting some kind of a cyber attack on the Pentagon, and I say, no, I just have a few screens actually. I'm doing pretty boring document drafting for the most part. But these guys have the greatest of setups, right? We're talking there are multiple screens. They don't even use like those standard Visa mounts, which we should do another episode about. They have their own custom mechanism, and this world of control center design is actually its whole industry. Like I once requested, you could order a free catalog, and I wrote a very cheeky message. I said, I have to be honest, I'm a guy in Jerusalem. I'm not going to be ordering a control center from you, but if you would send me one of your brochures in the mail, it would be much appreciated. And they did. I said, that was awesome. So Winstead Communications, thank you guys for that. It's still on my shelf, and anytime I'm thinking about building out my screen array, trust me, I still open that catalog. So another thing you'll see in these control centers, besides the screens, is that they have a few time zone clocks. And we talked about Zulu time before. You'll commonly see local Zulu, especially in military and aviation contexts. And then you'll often see different time zones. Now, me being me, if you know me, and if the listeners know me at this point, you'll know that I scoured the internet on not one occasion trying to find one. Now, here's the thing. These things are super expensive. You might think that when you walk into your local discount store, you see an LCD wall clock for sale for $20. How much could they cost? Have a guess. Well, I'll tell you. They can cost upwards of $1,000. And that's very conservative, these high-end wall clocks. So, sadly, I haven't made my millions yet in the startup world. So what I did instead yesterday was I got a couple of single display LCDs just with hours and minutes. And I'll set them at a different time, and I'll just put a little plaque beneath them. It's about $950 cheaper than actually finding a dual display clock, which I actually couldn't. Hello, little man, I'm with you in just in a sec. So in the course of looking for these, I'm just going to pick up the little Ezra before he goes for his sleep. In the course of looking for these, I came across this whole industry of specialist clock suppliers. That's one of those things that only I would find on the internet, but I'm guessing exists in every country. You have websites in Israel, not a huge place, who do nothing but sell these higher end LCD clock display systems. And what I want to ask about, Herman and Corn, is one of the things that they stocked were NTP servers. Now, if you've ever tried to set the time on a Linux server, you've probably seen the acronym NTP, Network Time Protocol. And time zones are a really important thing in computers. I wrote an article once about the time zone king, responsible for the time zone database. But I was familiar with NTP, but I didn't know there was actually standalone NTP hardware, like on-premise hardware, whose task was just to sync NTP data and then I guess sync that up with the clocks. So Herman and Corn, I'd love to chat about this whole world of specialist wall clock hardware, and this is maybe one of those prompts that yes, no one's made a podcast episode about this before. Clearly, whether we're talking about in the context of aviation control centers, military time zones, military control centers, the rest of it, not only do these guys have some pretty superb wall clocks, they take the very process of syncing accurate time from NTP very seriously. They don't just have, an NTP package installed on a server like most of us do. They actually have standalone physical hardware that is just an NTP relay. So Herman and Corn, who's using this stuff? And do you think my cheap and cheerful method was the best way, or might I be able to find my lovely jewel clock eventually? Over to you two.
It is funny how you can live with someone for years and still be surprised by their niche obsessions. Our housemate Daniel has been walking around the apartment in a Bluetooth headset all morning, dodging his son Ezra, just so he could record a voice memo about wall clocks. I found him in the pantry at one point, whispering about oscillators while Ezra was trying to find the Cheerios.
Herman Poppleberry at your service, and I have to say I am fully on board with Daniel on this one. Timing is one of those invisible pillars of civilization. You do not think about it until your train is late or your bank transaction fails, but behind the scenes there is this incredible, almost obsessive world of high-precision hardware. It is the heartbeat of the modern world, corn. If the clocks stop talking to each other, the world effectively stops spinning.
It is a classic Daniel move, too. He goes to Tel Aviv for a business meeting, sees a fancy mission control room at a tech firm, and suddenly he is requesting catalogs for industrial furniture and $1,000 clocks. He sent me a photo of this dual display unit, big, glowing red digits, one for local time and one for Zulu time, and he was genuinely distressed that he didn't have one in his home office. But he actually raised a really interesting point in his prompt. Why do these high-stakes environments like aviation, nuclear power plants, or military command centers spend thousands on standalone hardware for something as simple as the time? I mean, my phone knows the time. My laptop knows the time. Why do you need a dedicated box on a rack just to say it is 10:15 in the morning?
That is exactly the rabbit hole we are diving into today. And it is much deeper than just looking at a pretty display on a wall. It is about the difference between knowing the time and guaranteeing the time across a massive, complex network where even a few milliseconds of drift can cause a catastrophe. We are talking about the transition from consumer-grade convenience to mission-critical synchronization.
So let us start there. Daniel mentioned seeing these expensive liquid crystal display wall clocks synced to dedicated on-premise network time protocol hardware. For anyone who is not a network engineer, let us define that. Network Time Protocol, or NTP, is the standard way computers synchronize their clocks over a network. But usually, we just point our computers to a server on the internet, right? I click a button in my settings, and Apple or Google tells me what time it is.
Exactly. Most of us use what is called the NTP pool. Your computer sends a request to a public server, the server says, here is the current time, and your computer adjusts its internal clock. For most people, being off by a few dozen milliseconds does not matter. If your email is timestamped 30 milliseconds late, nobody cares. If your Netflix show starts a fraction of a second after your neighbor's, the world keeps turning.
But in a control center, that is a different story.
A completely different story. Think about air traffic control. You have radar data coming in from multiple sites, you have flight strips being updated, and you have voice recordings of pilot communications. All of that data has to be perfectly synchronized. If the radar system thinks a plane is at a certain coordinate at time X, but the communication system logs the pilot's response at time Y, and those two systems are out of sync by even a quarter of a second, you can no longer accurately reconstruct the sequence of events. In the event of a near miss or an accident, that audit trail is the only thing investigators have. If the clocks are wrong, the truth is lost.
Right. So it is about the audit trail and the real-time coordination. But why the hardware? Why not just run an NTP server as a software service on one of the big powerful servers they already have in the rack? They have these massive Xeon processors, Surely they can handle telling the time.
This is where we get into the nitty-gritty of computer architecture and why Daniel saw those dedicated boxes. General-purpose operating systems like Windows or even standard Linux are what we call non-deterministic. They are busy doing a million things at once. The processor is jumping between background tasks, security scans, user inputs, and network traffic. It is like a chef trying to cook a 10-course meal while also answering the phone and doing the taxes.
So if a time request comes in, the processor might be busy for a millisecond before it answers.
Precisely. That is called jitter. When you run NTP as software on a standard server, the time it takes for that server to process the request and send the packet back varies. It might take 1 millisecond this time and 5 milliseconds the next time, depending on what the antivirus software is doing. For high-end applications, that inconsistency is the enemy. Standalone NTP hardware, often called the time server or a master clock, uses specialized chips, sometimes field programmable gate arrays or FPGAs, as that do nothing but handle time packets at the hardware level. There is no operating system thinking about it. The packet hits the network card, the hardware stamps it with the time immediately and sends it back. The response is near instant and, more importantly, it is perfectly consistent every single time.
That makes sense. It is the difference between asking a busy person for the time while they are typing an email versus having a dedicated person whose only job in life is to point at a stopwatch. But there is also the source of the time itself, right? If you are in a military bunker or a high-security data center, you probably cannot just ping a server at Google.
That is a huge factor. Security and autonomy. These standalone units are almost always what we call Stratum One servers. In the world of timekeeping, we use a hierarchy. Stratum 0 is the actual source, the truth. This is an atomic clock, usually based on the vibrations of a cesium atom or a global positioning system satellite. Stratum 1 is a device directly connected to that source.
So these boxes Daniel saw probably have a big antenna on the roof of the building.
Exactly. They have an antenna pulling signals from GPS or other global navigation satellite systems like Galileo in Europe or GLONASS in Russia. The hardware box inside the building takes that satellite signal, which is incredibly precise because it is based on atomic clocks in space, and translates it into NTP for the local network. This means even if the entire internet goes down, or if the building is completely air-gapped for security reasons, meaning it has no physical connection to the outside web, everyone inside that building still has the exact same perfectly accurate time. They are their own island of temporal truth.
I can see why the military would want that. You do not want your missile defense system waiting for a timeout from a public server in another country. But let us talk about the clocks themselves, the actual displays on the wall. Daniel was looking at these dual display wall clocks from brands like Gorgie Timing or Wharton Electronics. One might show local time, and the other might show Zulu time, which is basically Greenwich Mean Time used by pilots in the military. He said they can cost over $1,000. That still feels like a lot per display. My microwave has a clock, Herman. It cost $80 and it also makes popcorn.
It sounds like a lot until you look at what is inside these industrial units. These are not just clocks in the sense of a battery-powered quartz movement you buy at a home goods store. They are network appliances. Each of those wall clocks is essentially a tiny computer with a specialized network card. They use power over Ethernet or PoE, which means they get their power and their data over a single Cat6 cable.
Which is convenient for installation, I guess. You do not need an electrician to put an outlet high up on every wall.
Right, but the real cost comes from the reliability and the sync. These industrial clocks are designed to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for decades. They do not have fans that can fail. They have specialized high-visibility displays, often using high-contrast LEDs or specialized LCD overlays that do not wash out under bright fluorescent office lights or direct sunlight in a hangar. And most importantly, they are constantly talking to that master clock. If the master clock shifts by a microsecond, the wall clock follows. In a large facility like an airport, you might have 200 of these clocks. You need to know with absolute certainty that the clock in the hangar shows the exact same second as the clock in the cockpit and the clock in the command center. If they drift apart, the system breaks down.
I suppose there is also a psychological element in those environments. If you are a controller and you see two clocks that are slightly out of sync, maybe the seconds are ticking at different times, it erodes your trust in the entire system. You start wondering what else is slightly off. Is the radar lagging? Is the radio delayed?
Spot on. It is about system integrity. In aviation, they call it the single source of truth. If you have multiple displays, they must agree. If they do not, you have a systemic failure of confidence. It is the same reason why, in a hospital, the clocks in the operating rooms have to be perfectly synced with the clocks in the nurse's station. When you are logging the time of a medical event, every second counts for the legal and medical record.
So, who else is using this, beyond the guys in flight suits and the people in bunkers?
You would be surprised. Financial institutions are a huge one. High-frequency trading relies on time-stamping transactions at the microsecond or even nanosecond level. If your bank's clock is slower than the stock exchange's clock, you lose money because someone else can front-run your trade. They use even more advanced versions called PTP, or Precision Time Protocol.
I remember reading about that. That is even more hardcore than NTP, right?
Much more. While NTP gets you within a few milliseconds, PTP, which is defined by the IEEE 1588 standard, can get you into the nanosecond range. It actually accounts for the path delay, the time it takes the signal to travel through the physical copper wires of the network. It is literally measuring the speed of electricity through the cable to subtract that tiny delay from the time calculation.
That is wild. It is literally accounting for the physical length of the wire. What about other industries?
Power grids are another big one. When you are balancing the load of an entire country's electricity, you have to synchronize the phase of the alternating current across different power plants. If they are out of sync, you get massive equipment damage or blackouts. They use these same dedicated time servers and wall clocks to keep everything in lockstep. Even broadcast television stations use them so that when they switch from the local news to the national feed, the transition is seamless down to the frame. If the timing is off, you get that weird flicker or a black frame that ruins the broadcast.
It is interesting because Daniel mentioned his cheap solution, which was buying two separate LCD clocks from a hardware store and just setting them manually. He said it saved him $950. But for him, the cost of failure is just being a few minutes late to a meeting or Ezra missing a nap. In these other industries, the cost of failure is millions of dollars or human lives.
Exactly. It is a classic example of industrial grade versus consumer grade. But I do want to address Daniel's question about whether there is a better or more cost-effective way to get that high-quality look without spending thousands of dollars. Because for a home office or a small business, a $5,000 timing rack is obviously overkill. You do not need a rubidium atomic clock to know when it is time for lunch.
Yeah, he mentioned his hack of two single displays with plaques underneath. It works, but it lacks that mission control. Polish where the numbers are perfectly synchronized. If I am looking at two clocks and the seconds are ticking at slightly different times, it would drive me crazy. It is like a visual itch you cannot scratch.
Me too. It would be like a dripping faucet. But there is a middle ground. You do not have to buy the military-grade stuff to get the military-grade functionality.
Are you thinking about the Raspberry Pi route? I knew you were going to bring up the Pi.
You know me too well. For the price of a nice dinner, you can actually build a Stratum One time server. You take a Raspberry Pi, which is a tiny $50 computer, and you buy a GPS hat for it. That is an add-on board with a tiny antenna connector. You plug it in, install some open source software like Crony or NTPD, and suddenly you have a clock that is accurate to within microseconds, synced directly to the atomic clocks on the satellites. You are essentially building your own mini version of what the military uses.
And then you just need a way to display it so it looks cool on the wall.
Right. Instead of buying a proprietary $1,000 wall clock, you can use any old monitor or even a tablet. There are great open source projects on GitHub that create clock faces that pull time from an NTP server. You could take a cheap ultra-wide monitor, mount it on the wall, and have it display 6 different time zones, all perfectly synced to your local Pi-based time server. It gives you that NASA look for about 1/10 of the price.
That sounds like a fun weekend project for Daniel. But let us talk about the dual display, specifically. If you want that classic look, two distinct sets of red or green LED digits in a single chassis, is there a way to do that without the industrial markup?
There are actually some great prosumer companies now. There is a brand called Global Time and another called Time Machines. They make PoE wall clocks that are designed for schools and hospitals. They are much cheaper than the military ones, maybe $200 or $300 instead of $1,000, but they still speak NTP. You just plug them into your router, tell them the IP address of your Raspberry Pi time server, and they stay perfect forever. No batteries, no manual setting, no drifting.
I like that. It is the set it and forget it model. But I want to go back to the hardware versus software thing for a second, because I think there is a deeper lesson there about how we build systems. We are so used to the idea that software can do anything. We think, oh, just write an app for that. But there are certain physical realities, like the latency of a processor or the jitter of an operating system, that software just cannot fix.
That is such a profound point, Corn. We live in this world of abstraction layers. We think we are interacting with the time, but we are actually interacting with a series of guesses and approximations made by layers of code. When you go down to the hardware level, you are stripping away those layers. You are getting closer to the physical reality of the signal. In a way, these dedicated time servers are the only things in a data center that are actually grounded in the physical world. Everything else is just data, but the time server is connected to a satellite, which is a physical object in orbit, governed by the laws of relativity in physics.
Wait, did you just say relativity? Are these clocks actually accounting for time dilation? Like Einstein's relativity?
Oh, absolutely. This is one of my favorite nerd facts. Because the GPS satellites are moving so fast, about 14,000 kilometers per hour, and they are further away from the Earth's gravity, their internal clocks actually run at a different speed than clocks on the ground. Special relativity says their speed makes them tick slower by about 7 microseconds a day. But general relativity says the weaker gravity up there makes them tick faster by about 45 microseconds a day.
So they are fighting each other?
Exactly. The net result is that the satellite clocks run about 38 microseconds fast every single day. If the engineers did not account for Einstein's theories, the GPS coordinates on your phone would be off by 10 kilometers within a single day. So, when Daniel looks at a clock synced to GPS, he is literally seeing the results of Einstein's equations being solved in real time. It is a cosmic correction happening right there on his wall.
Okay, that officially makes wall clocks cool. I take back everything I thought about them being boring. You're not just looking at the time. You're looking at a corrected signal from a satellite that is fighting against the warping of space-time.
Exactly. And that is why the hardware matters. To do those calculations and maintain that sync without adding its own delay, the hardware has to be purpose-built. It cannot be waiting for a Windows update to finish or a security scan to clear. It has to be always on and always precise.
I think there is also a resilience angle here that we should mention. We talked about air gapping, but there is also the issue of GPS jamming or spoofing. If you are a high-end facility, do you just trust the satellite? What happens if someone knocks out the signal?
That is a great question. The really high-end units, the ones that cost the big bucks, actually have what is called a holdover capability. Inside the box, they have a very high-quality internal oscillator. Usually, it is a rubidium atomic clock or an oven-controlled crystal oscillator, which we call an OCXO. It is basically a quartz crystal kept at a perfectly constant temperature in a little internal oven, so it does not drift due to heat or cold.
So, if someone jams the GPS signal, the box says, I have lost the satellites, but I am so stable I can keep the time myself for the next month without losing a millisecond.
Precisely. That holdover is what you are paying for. A cheap NTP server will start drifting the moment it loses its source. A military grade 1 will stay accurate for weeks or months in total isolation. It is about building a system that can survive the worst case scenario. It is the ultimate insurance policy for your data.
It is interesting to see how this connects to the broader trend of edge computing. We spent the last decade moving everything to the cloud, but now we are realizing that for certain things, like time or security or immediate processing, you need the edge. You need a physical box in your building. You cannot outsource the laws of physics to a server in another state.
It is a pendulum. We centralize, then we decentralize. But time is the ultimate decentralized thing. Every location on Earth has its own local. time in a physical sense, and trying to sync them all back to a central cloud server is actually a really hard physics problem. Having a local Stratum One source is the only way to truly own your time.
So, for our listeners who are not running a nuclear silo but want a cool office setup like Daniel, what is the takeaway? How do they get that mission control vibe without spending their kids' college fund?
I would say, first, appreciate the invisible infrastructure. Next time you are in an airport and you see those synchronized clocks, realize there is a whole world of Stratum One servers and relativity-corrected signals making that happen. Second, if you want the look without the cost, look into Power over Ethernet clocks. They are the secret of the industry. They are reliable, easy to install, and they give you that perfect sync. Brands like Time Machines are great for this.
And if you are really adventurous, build the Raspberry Pi time server. It is a great way to learn about networking, Linux, and physics at the same time. You can get a GPS hat for about $35 and a Pi for $50.
Plus, you get to tell people you have a Stratum One atomic synced time source in your living room. It is the ultimate nerd flex. When someone asks, "What time is it?" you can say, "According to my local cesium reference source, it is exactly," and then give them 8 decimal places.
I can see Daniel doing that. He will have a plaque made for the Raspberry Pi too, the Ezra One time server. He will probably try to explain time dilation to a 3-year-old.
Honestly, I would respect that. Ezra will be the only kid in preschool who understands special relativity.
You know, we have done over 500 episodes of this show, and I think this is the first time we've really spent 20 minutes talking about the TikTok of the universe. It is a good reminder that even the most boring things, like a clock on a wall, have incredible depth if you look closely enough. It is all about the layers of technology that keep our world from falling into chaos.
That is the whole spirit of My Weird Prompts, isn't it? Daniel sees a clock in Tel Aviv, and we find Einstein in atomic physics. Everything is connected if you follow the wires long enough.
Exactly. Well, I think we have covered the who, the why, and the how for Daniel. Hopefully this helps him with his apartment setup, though I suspect he might now spend even more money on a GPS antenna for his roof. I will have to tell him to check the lease before he starts drilling holes for satellite cables.
If he does, I am helping him install it. I want to see those nanoseconds in action. We can compare his clock to the one in the local bank and see who is winning.
Fair enough. Before we wrap up, I just want to say to everyone listening, if you have been enjoying these deep dives into the weird corners of technology and brotherly theorizing, please consider leaving us a review. Whether you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, those ratings really do help other curious minds find the show. We are trying to reach more people who care about things like NDP jitter and industrial design.
It really does make a difference. We see every one of them, and we appreciate you sticking with us through 576 episodes of this. It is a long time to be talking about weird prompts, but we are not stopping anytime soon.
Absolutely. You can find our full archive, including the episode where we talked about the time zone king that Daniel mentioned, at myweirdprompts.com. We have an RSS feed there and a contact form if you want to send in your own weird prompts. Maybe you have a question about something even more obscure than wall clocks.
Just keep them coming. We live for this stuff. The weirder, the better.
Alright, that is it for today. Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry. We will see you in the next one.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.